guys doing today? How are all your GDC hangovers treating you? I've been there. Housekeeping, please silence, mute, airplane mode your phones, close laptop screens if you don't mind. You will be getting an email about how you can rate me, how I did. I hope to earn a good review, but you will be getting that, and you are free to describe me as you see fit. I'd also like to say it's a huge honor to be presenting here at GDC, and I take it as a personal honor that you all came to see my presentation. I know there's a lot of cool stuff going on. I know there's a lot of important meetings. So I'm very flattered that you came here. And this talk, oops, getting a little excited with my buttons. There we go. So this talk is about choice. The choices we make as game developers and the trade-offs we have to make to get games made with the constraints we're all under. And my favorite quote about this comes from Cliff Bleszinski. It's about the trade-offs you decide on as a designer. It's like playing an RPG where you have 20 points allocated to strength, dexterity, and intelligence, and you can't have it all. And I love this because you're describing the art of game design in terms of game design. It's meta. So, often we make these kind of decisions based on instinct, which is fine. But a lot of times we make them because we get backed into them, because of those restrictions. We make these choices reactively. What I want to propose today is that there's a framework that we can make these decisions proactively based on who our target end user is, what the competitive set looks like, and what our best practices are. So to open up, I want to start with a tale of two games that are very near and dear to my heart, Dark Souls and Resident Evil 6. Both came out in October of their respective years. Both had about 2 years of development time. Resident Evil 6 outsold Dark Souls by about 70% in terms of physical units, and yet history tends to remember Dark Souls as a critical and commercial success, and Resident Evil 6 is a critical and commercial failure. So the relevant question then is, why is the game that sold 70% more units considered the failure of the two? And that's what I want to talk about today. In this presentation, I'm calling strategic design, or why Dark Souls is the IKEA of games. So who am I? I started in the industry about 10 years ago as a humble production intern at Wide Load Games in Chicago, Illinois. Worked my way up to a studio lead senior producer position on games like Guilty Party, Avengers Initiative, and with our sister studio Avalanche working on Disney Infinity. Over that time, I really developed a firm belief that the human cost of making games in terms of layoffs and crunch and health issues and studio closures and uncertainty was a little more than I could stomach. And I decided the best way for me to be able to positively impact that would be to learn as much about business and management as I could. So in addition to working full-time and raising kids, I went to night school and earned an MBA at Northwestern University. I'm currently working as a consultant, notably with my friends at Ragtag as they work to finish Raise the Dead. I'm also trying to get my own company, Agency Principal, up and running and off the ground. And I write regularly in my blog, Breaking the Wheel, where I apply these sort of business theoretical concepts to game development. So if you enjoy this talk, there's a lot more material there. Shameless plug. All right, so if you go to business school, you will run into this guy a lot. This guy's name is Michael Porter from the Harvard Business School. He's a PhD in economics and a luminary in the field of business strategy. And he has two major claims to fame. One is something called a 5 forces analysis, and the other is codifying what he calls a true competitive advantage. To understand a competitive advantage, you have to understand another of his constructs, which is called the productivity frontier. This graph compares the value a product has for the end user versus the cost to make it. That arc represents the line of best practice. It's the equilibrium point in a market. You can't do better than that line. You can't get something that's more valuable for customers without it costing more, and you can't cut costs without reducing value. This is like the pinnacle of best practices in an industry. Eventually, a company's going to figure out how to get past that through some new process or best practice or patent or intellectual property or access to some new resource. And for a while, they're going to have a market advantage. They're going to be able to make things faster for cheaper, but eventually the market will catch up. And we all as a society benefit because products overall are better and cheaper, but everybody benefits except for that one company. And Porter calls this shifting the productivity frontier. The moral of this story is that faster, cheaper, better is only a temporary advantage. You cannot derive a sustained market advantage from operational efficiency alone. So what do? In his landmark article, What is Strategy? Harvard Business Review, 1996, I highly recommend you read it. Porter offers what he calls a true competitive advantage based on 3 things. Being different, making trade-offs, and achieving fit. So what do these things mean? First off, being different. Means creating something that is unique and valuable. You can do this in one of 3 ways, according to Porter. You can be few things to many people. His example is Jiffy Lube. They will work on any car, but they will only do car lubricants. They don't do body work. They don't do engine work, just car lubricants. You can be many things to few people. His example is Bessemer Trust, which is a full-featured financial services company that will handle all your banking needs, but only if you have at least $250,000 of liquid assets. Or you can be many things to many people in a narrow market. Porter's example is Carnatic Cinemas, which is a theater chain, full-featured, but only operates in cities of 150,000 people or less. Now, to understand why being unique and different is so important, I direct you to the Kawasaki matrix. This is something that Guy Kawasaki of Apple fame brings up in every talk I've ever seen him give on YouTube. It's a very simple 2x2 matrix that compares uniqueness to value. So if you are valuable but not unique, you have to compete on your margin. You have to give consumers more for their dollar and get less in return, which means you have to sell more units to compensate. Extreme example would be toilet paper. Very valuable, not unique. So toilet paper companies have to offer more sheets per roll, more rolls per dollar than the competition, and that's why toilet paper companies make about a penny per package or a penny per roll in terms of profit. If you're not valuable and not unique, you're essentially the dot-com boom. You're creating a bunch of stuff that's not useful for customers, but makes a lot of money for hedge fund managers and stock speculators. If you're unique but not valuable, in Kawasaki's words, you're just kind of stupid. You're making something nobody's gonna buy, and you're spending a lot of time. Now, if you're doing that for your own artistic means, totally cool, but if you have an intent to sell it and nobody wants to buy it, you're kind of wasting a lot of time. So you want to be here, unique and valuable, where you can sell things to people that they want to buy, you can charge them a price that they think is fair, but still allows you to maintain a healthy margin. Kawasaki's mnemonic to remember this is you want to be like George W. Bush, high and to the right. I don't know exactly what he means by that, but I remember it, so clearly it works. Next up, trade-offs. It's important to recognize that doing everything is not strategy. It is indecision. Strategy means often choosing what not to do. Example here, the production triangle. Good, cheap, fast. You don't get all three. It's hard to have a service that is both luxurious and fast. It's hard to have a product that has lots of options and is easy to use. And you gotta recognize that some activities are incompatible, like I just mentioned. Next up is fit. This is a really key concept for a competitive strategy. Your activities need to fit each other. They need to interact and reinforce one another. So for example, if you're using multiplayer code, it behooves you to have mechanics that don't require a high degree of computational precision. This is why it's really hard to do netcode for Street Fighter. Now, why is this so important? Being different allows you to uniquely serve a target audience. Trade-offs allow you to serve that target audience at a lower cost than anybody else. And fit makes it harder for other companies to compete with you. They cannot just replicate one part of your value chain. They have to replicate all of it to replicate your success. Porter's example was Southwest Airlines. Now, in the 20 years since What a Strategy came out, they've since changed their MO a little bit, but back in 1996, Southwest was many things to few people. It was a full-service airline catering to price-sensitive customers who didn't care about perks and were going between regional airports. Southwest made a lot of trade-offs. There was, they only stuck to the regional airports, so you wouldn't find them in O'Hare or LAX. They had no frequent flyer program, they had no first-class seating, they didn't deal with baggage transfers, and they only used 737 jets, which meant they couldn't do long-haul flights. This would seem to put them at a disadvantage until you consider the element of fit. The fact that they're in regional airports meant they had to pay less for gate rights. They didn't have to negotiate as hard. The fact that they had no frequent flyer program meant that they'd streamline ticketing. The fact that there's no first-class seating and no baggage transfer means they could turn around planes in about half the time. And the fact that they only use 737 jets means they only had to train their crews to service 737 jets and only had to carry parts for 737 jets, which reduced their overhead. The net effect is that Southwest was faster, cheaper, and better, but for the target consumer. They made a choice. We're going to target these people over here at the expense of these people over here, which is totally fine. And there's no secret sauce here. There's no trade secret. They just had very good operational harmony. Now, how effective is this? 1993, Continental launches Continental Light with the intent of going directly head-to-head with Southwest Airlines, but they didn't make the same trade-offs. They kept their frequent flyer program, they kept first-class seating, they kept baggage transfers, they used different kinds of jets. Total failure. Such a bad failure, they killed it 2 years later. Board of directors fired the CEO over it. Porter's other example is Ikea. Much like Southwest, Ikea is all things to few people. They are targeting young, price-sensitive customers who are price-sensitive but not time-sensitive and have rigid schedules because they're earlier in their careers. They can't dictate their own hours yet. Ikea makes a lot of trade-offs. They're often located way the hell out in BFE, so you got a driveway out to get to them. There's no-show people. There's no customization. You got to build it yourself. They offer food court and childcare, and they are open late. Much like Southwest, this would seem to put Ikea at a disadvantage until you consider the element of fit. So the fact they're in the suburbs means they can have a really large property for really cheap, which means they can have bigger parking lots, which makes it easier to park, Bigger showrooms to show more furniture, and bigger warehouses so they can have more on-hand inventory. Customers don't mind making the trip. They're not time sensitive. They just want a deal. The fact that there's no show people means you have less staff. You have less operational overhead. And customers are fine showing themselves around because what you see is what you get. You don't need salespeople because you can see the Gajora bed right next to the Nordenberg lamp on top of the, I can't remember all the names of these things, but you know what I'm saying. Like, you can just see the furniture right there. You don't need a salesperson to describe it to you. And the fact that there's no customization means they have streamlined manufacturing. It's really easy to have a streamlined process if you just have to make one kind of a thing over and over again. It's easy to store and deliver boxes because they stack really well in trucks and in cars and in warehouse shelves. And time-sensitive customers don't mind building because they have time. They just don't have money. So those amenities, the food court, the daycare, the fact they're open late would seem like extravagances, but it means that customers can go straight from work because there'll be food there. They don't have to get a sitter because IKEA will take care of their kids. And they don't have to rush and stress themselves out about finding traffic because IKEA is going to be open late. The net effect is, once again, IKEA is better for the target customer while still being profitable. But it has reduced appeal to time-sensitive, price-insensitive customers who want customization and high quality. Again, IKEA made a choice. We're going to target these people over here at the expense of these people over here. That is the essence of strategy. So to the meat of the presentation, why is Dark Souls the IKEA of games? If it's not obvious by now, I mean that as a compliment. So let's think of the target audience for Dark Souls. A hardcore gamer, enjoys discovery, likes pushing the boulder up the hill like Sisyphus, wants depth, and wants thrilling, menacing experiences. These are gamers who want games that are like badges of honor if they win. Now, does Dark Souls meet the criteria for a competitive advantage? Was it different? Sorry, skipping ahead. Was it different? Did it make trade-offs? Did it have fit? Well, Dark Souls is definitely different. It was a hardcore, unforgiving, no-frills game in an industry of cinematic mass-market titles. I'm pretty sure that picture is from one of the later Dark Souls games, but a $200 million person body count really kind of emphasizes my point here. Dark Souls makes a lot of trade-offs. Few cinematics, almost no tutorial, one difficulty level, sparse music, limited multiplayer, and it wasn't exactly using a cutting-edge engine. Much like IKEA and Southwest, this would seem to put Dark Souls at a disadvantage until you think about fit. So the fact that there's few cinematics and very little tutorial means you had to figure it out for yourself. Tutorials are rat's nest of edge cases, cinematics can be expensive to produce. You don't have them to lead somebody by the hand, that means you gotta figure it out for yourself. That means it is the difficult game that the target audience really wants. You gotta figure out how Dark Souls works. Or you buy the strategy guide if you're a punk. I bought the strategy guide. There's one difficulty level means you have focus balancing. You don't have to balance for easy, medium, hard, extra hard. There's just the Dark Souls level of difficulty. And that means it's take it or leave it. If you beat Dark Souls, you have to beat Dark Souls, which means you're one of the elite, which means it has that badge of honor that the target sect was looking for. Sparse music cuts costs, but it also makes the world of Dark Souls feel far more sparse and desolate and menacing. So it's a cut that made it better. This is the essence of a competitive advantage. Limited multiplayer is focused multiplayer. And the fact that you're reusing the tech from Dark Souls reduces some of their unknowns. Known tech, experienced tech is known tech, it's predictable tech, relatively speaking. Those trade-offs combine to create a harsh, uncomfortable, sink-or-swim experience, which is exactly what the target audience was looking for. And From Software are genre experts. They've been making this kind of game since Kingsfield on the PS1. This really helps them hone what they're doing and hone their activities. The net effect is it felt tailor-made for an audience that often feels ignored or overlooked by the AAA games industry. And these trade-offs allow From Software to focus effort without sacrificing quality, again, for the target audience. And that means that Dark Souls could be more profitable with a smaller market. And in deference to Mr. Porter, I call this notion strategic design. Now, if we contrast this with the other game from my introduction, Resident Evil 6, and I say this as somebody for whom Resident Evil is my favorite game series ever, Resident Evil 6 tried to do the opposite. It tried to take a niche brand to the mass market. Producer at the time said, we're making games and we need to have mass market appeal to survive. And that mass market design approach, trying to target as many people as possible, meant that Resident Evil 6 couldn't cut costs and had a hurdle rate of 7 million units. In the intro, I said Resident Evil 6 outsold Dark Souls by 70%. It would have to have sold an additional 40% to make its own target. The net effect is best expressed by Resident Evil 7's producer, Masashiki Kawata. By trying to please everyone, you please no one. And if the direction of Resident Evil 7 is any indication, this was a lesson painfully learned. Now, some of you might be asking, how intentional was this on From Software's part? How intentional were these designs? Did they read Michael Porter's article? Were they thinking in terms of cuts and targeting a target market? The answer, honest, no bullshit answer is, I don't know. I tried to find out. I wrote to Bandai Namco, they couldn't help me. I reached through a press contact to go through some PR contacts at Bandai Namco, they couldn't help me. If you go to From Software's website, they tell you to go to Bandai Namco. So I ran into a dead end. But really, that's not my point. My point is not that From Software read Michael Porter's What a Strategy and decided to emulate it. My point is that Dark Souls provides a prototype by which you can make these decisions intentionally. I believe that Dark Souls verifies that this framework can apply to games effectively. So to that end, recommendations in 7 timeless quotes. First of all, he who defends everything defends nothing, Friedrich the Great, King of Prussia. I'm going to reiterate this because it bears reiterating. Strategy means making choices, deciding what to do and deciding what not to do. And always recognize that trade-offs yield benefits. They reduce costs, and they make it harder for other companies to compete. And I see lots of cameras going off, and that's cool, but I'm going to give you a link to download these slides, so don't stress about getting every frame. Good example here is XCOM. XCOM was XCOM. If you weren't there to get slapped around by a really hard turn-based strategy game, it did not make any compromises for you. And that is exactly what it should have done, and that's why it's so successful and why its fans are so ravenous about it. Because it served them very well, and it didn't make compromises to dilute the experience for that target segment. Next up, know thy enemy and know thyself, and in 100 battles you will never be in peril, Sun Tzu. So get to know your target audience and figure out what it really wants. This is basic marketing research stuff. You can do persona exercises where you hypothesize a member of the audience, try to think ahead of what they might be about, what they're interested in, what their day looks like, what kind of media they consume. Go out and actually find some of them, do one-on-one interviews, talk to them, see what they're actually about. You can use more advanced survey techniques like factor and cluster analysis and conjoint analysis, and if you want to know what the hell that means, it's in the appendix of these slides, which you can download, but I can also talk about it during Q&A if you're interested, but you might need a professional survey company to help you with that. But you want to use this information to pick your trade-offs and prioritize features. Good example here is Supercell. Supercell knows how to dial in an audience really well. They kill off anything that's not going to be a huge hit with their audience, and they know how to test and retest until they have games that are going to be huge hits. That's why Heyday and Clash of Clans are still on the top of the charts multiple years later. If I'd asked people what they want, they would have said faster horses, Henry Ford. So those last few slides notwithstanding, I am not advocating design by focus group or design by survey. That is a road to mediocrity. And the reason is because people don't know what they want. It's your job to show them. This is one case where I think that asshole is absolutely correct. Now, this sounds pretentious, but I think what Jobs meant is that most consumers are not professional product developers, and most gamers are not professional game designers. It is not reasonable to ask them to construct things and conceive game designs in their head. That's not what their training is. They don't know what they want yet. But they do know what they like, and that is a very important distinction to draw. Don't know what they want, but they do know what they like. So figure out what they're passionate about. Figure what needs other games aren't answering. Tailor your feature set accordingly. Great example here is Resident Evil 4, which is my favorite game of all time and kind of my apology for shitting on Resident Evil 6 a little bit. If Shinji Mikami had gone to guys like me who are huge Resident Evil fans and said, what do you want in the next game? We probably would have said more zombies, bigger guns, bigger mansions, more puzzles. Instead, he scrapped that design and rebirthed both a genre and a game series with one of the most successful games of the last decade. I think he knew exactly what he wanted to do. I think he knew what the audience was interested in, and he was okay with trusting his instinct to give them something that met their needs, but wasn't exactly what they asked for. Retreat hell, we are just attacking in a different direction. Lieutenant General Chesty Puller. So I'm not, in this concept of strategic design, I'm not advocating that you resign yourself to subsistence revenue or hiding from the competition. I'm not saying you should get used to scratching a living off bare rocks. It's not, and it's also not about compromising quality to save money. The goal here is to find underserved niches, make games those niches will love, and then use trade-offs to make that niche profitable and make it harder for other companies to compete with you. A good example here is Gone Home. Gone Home knew exactly the kind of game it was going to make. If you read the design, it would seem very humble, but their dedication to that idea and to serving the people who want to play that kind of game earned them a level of notability and accord that belied how simple that design was. And they deserve every bit of that accord, in my opinion. Music is the space between notes, Claude Debussy. So when you're considering what cuts to make, don't just take a hatchet to your design. Don't just hack things off willy-nilly without thinking through what you're trying to do. You want to try to cut things that run contrary to your target feature set to enable yourself to focus on those targets. Example here, Uncharted. Uncharted, for lack of a better term, was trying to make the Indiana Jones of video games. To that end, they had these very beautiful, refined, well-shot, well-acted, well-motion captured cinematic scenes. It's what we all love about that series. It's easy to forget, and I forgot this till I replayed it a couple months ago. That game is about 4 hours long. They cut quantity to support quality. It certainly did not hurt the franchise's long-term prospects, as we all know. The enemy of art is the absence of limitations. Orson Welles, according to his friend Henry Yaglin, we don't actually know if he said this, but it's still a good quote. The idea here is not to constrain creativity. Don't be a glass half empty person. The idea is to focus attention, efforts, and resources where they will provide the most value, both to your gamers and to your company. Good example here, the Doom reboot. Now, Doom eschewed a lot of features that prevailing logic would tell you modern shooters need. There was no romance, there was no ill-advised stealth section, weren't a ton of cinematics. It was a very focused design that was all about kill things dead real good. And that focus did not hurt the game. That focus made it an exceptional shooter that stands out drastically in the current field. Finally, the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. Elie Wiesel. Now, a lot of things a bunch of professional entrepreneurs and marketers and product developers get wrong is they get way too hung up about if people are gonna hate their product, or in this case, hate their game. But in order for one niche to love your game, you have to accept that another niche is probably gonna hate it. And that shouldn't bother you, because if the people who hate your game are diametrically opposed to your target audience, the fact that those people hate it is perversely supporting evidence. It means you're probably on target. What should freak you out a lot more than hate is indifference, because indifference means that people can't even be bothered to hate your game. They don't even care. So always remember that passionate fans are what create valuable brands. This is why engagement is far more important than traffic at a website. A million people showed up to your site. Who cares? Did they read anything? Did they buy anything? Did they sign up for a mailing list? Did they post about it on Facebook? Did they tell their friends about it? Having 1,000 people who are highly engaged is way more valuable than having 1 million people show up and go, meh. Now, another thing professional entrepreneurs, marketers, product developers get way too hung up on is the size of the target audience, whether it's too small. But it's important to recognize that your target audience is not the same thing as your addressable market. Your target audience builds your addressable market. How? Through good old-fashioned word of mouth. Your fans will evangelize for your game. And it's important to remember that word of mouth is the most valuable form of marketing there is. And it's the most valuable because it's the only form of marketing you cannot buy. You have to earn it. And you can try doing stealth and astroturf things, but you will get caught. So you can only get word of mouth the old-fashioned way. But your fans are only going to evangelize for you if they're passionately engaged because you made something that they love. So examples here, Abound, Kerbal Space Program, Counter-Strike, League of Legends, Halo, Minecraft alone demonstrates this point for me. So if you want to be the next Ikea or Dark Souls or Star Wars or Apple or Harry Potter or 9 Inch Nails, don't spend so much time worrying about making something that everybody's going to buy. Focus instead on making something that a segment of people will really love. And with that, I will turn it over for questions. But first, here's my contact info. If you scan that QR code, you'll get my contact details. 2 underscores, don't forget on the Twitter. You don't want to get the 1 underscore Justin Fischer. He hasn't tweeted in like 7 years. And that bit.ly link will give you annotated slides if you're interested. And I'm sharing them under a Creative Commons 4.0 license, so distribute them at your studios, amongst your friends. Just don't sell them or you gotta give me a cut. And also, if you enjoy my peculiar way of looking at the world, I'm doing another session on Friday about applying operations science to game development. So if you got production nerdy friends who are into production nerdy stuff, I welcome them with open arms. So any questions at the mics? Oh, thank you. I see one person walking up.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm just wondering if you think, because Dark Souls is a console game, do you think that console exclusivity plays into what you're talking about as far as like a limitation that could be beneficial?
It can be, yeah. I mean, it should be, where and who you target should be interrelated with your console, your platform choices. Like Halo is a great example of, you have one console that would seem to put you at a disadvantage, but it also allows you to focus your design on what you're trying to make and focus your technical efforts on what the specific hardware requirements are. So yeah, definitely that, if you're doing that in an intelligent way, you can really limit the potential for analysis paralysis. Did that answer your question?
Yep.
Thank you.
What are your thoughts on like identifying these niches based on sort of your own personal experience and anecdotal evidence versus like market research? Because I often find that producers and that they want that market research.
Yeah. It's hard to do. I mean, if you have lots of marketing muscle and dedicated marketing departments, it's a lot easier to kind of defer that work. But honestly, I think games to me are not like consumer products. They're all micro startups. So to me, it's the same thing as how base level startups in their early phases try to find customers. You go out and actually, who are you talking to? Who in whose hands are you putting builds? Who are you testing with? Like, don't undervalue the ability of shoe leather to start answering these questions for you. And if you're targeting the right people, if you're looking at those people who are really interested in being at the ground floor, who like to be at the cutting edge of game development, don't underestimate the ability of you to flatter them by bringing them in early. And that's how you can start building that base level of word of mouth. If somebody's like, hey, these guys brought me in, they asked my opinion, they let me see things. That can be a great way to start building that following. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Cool, thank you.
I just have one question about like, if you're building a game and you launch it and it's sort of like a good minimum viable product, it's the Dark Souls of whatever you're doing. Mm-hmm. If it has success and you continue updating it, you slowly add more and more features and craft, and it suddenly becomes not that experience. Yeah. What do you think about that, and how would you manage that type of game design and development? And
I think that sort of iteration, and there's plenty of examples of it. There's nothing wrong with evolving and bringing in more people over time. I mean, I think that, and especially for like businesses, that's kind of what you want to do. So to me, there's nothing bad about it as long as you're being intentional about it. Like, okay, we think this has a broader appeal to these people, and they'll put this feature set, but if you don't want to do it as like a panic routine, like we aren't selling enough, so let's just rope in more people without a really strategy. Let's just make it as mass market as possible. That's where you run into trouble. Or if you're really diluting what the core of what your game is, that core value proposition, and kind of messing it up with putting too much extraneous crap around it, that's where you can start running into problems. So to me, it's an analysis-driven decision. Like, okay, bring in more people, talk to them, have them play it, see what they think. Are sales getting better or worse? You still like your feel, are honoring the core values of the product, and that's how I would approach it.
Thanks.
Sure.
This is somewhat related to that, maybe a little bit theoretical, but do you think it's possible to take what Dark Souls did in terms of trade-offs and refocus that on a different audience, maybe even a larger audience? If you start selling groceries in an IKEA format, do you get Trader Joe's? Like, will that work?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, as long as you understand what your target audience is looking for and what trade-offs are either acceptable or in some ways preferable to them, like the Dark Souls difficulty thing, then yeah, I don't think the lesson from Dark Souls is that people want really hard games that are in a medieval setting with monsters. I think the lesson is that people want games that are made for them and that make them feel like somebody's paying attention to them and wants to service them specifically. So if you can figure out what makes people feel like they're being serviced specifically and that their needs are being answered, then it could work for any genre, any game. You just have to balance, the more people you get, the more people you're trying to target, the less specific you can get to their needs. And that's where the balance point is, and that's where you need to focus on your trade-offs and where your specific value point is. Does that make sense?
Thanks, yeah.
Sure.
So if you think about Dark Souls in terms of strategically delivering a project or product to a niche audience that were kind of forgotten by the industry, do you think that strategical advantage might get lost now that we as an industry are maturing and not forgetting about audiences and trying to balance out the products, and therefore strategical advantage will only come from creating new genres and new products for audiences that haven't been catered to at all yet?
No, I don't think it only needs to be new products, because if Dark Souls was a constantly evolving, constantly new content coming out kind of thing, like an Uber, like it just constantly persists, then yeah, I think you would need to constantly find new things to go to. But Dark Souls can coexist in a world with Nioh. And those two things, you don't say like, oh, I'm going to buy fewer copies of Dark Souls because Nioh is now here. It is scratching the same itch, it's serving the same audience, it's got a different bend to it. At that point, you got to figure out your competitive set is not just everything that's out there, but what's coming out proximate to your release and what's going to get buzz around the same time as you. So that's kind of where that strategic plan has to come into. Like, whose needs am I servicing? And not just are there other games, but are there other games that will be high profile at the same time? Does that answer your question?
A little bit. I guess, this industry is quite known for fast follow, so
yeah.
Dark Souls does well, and then everyone wants to make a Dark Souls game,
so
and no one's making AAA games anymore, so then 10 years later, oh wait, we should make a cinematic AAA game, you know what I mean? So it's cycles.
That goes to my point where I was making the other guy of The lesson from Dark Souls is not like make Dark Souls, it's make games for people. And the lesson of Halo was not people want guys in green suits blowing up aliens, it's that console gamers also like to shoot things. So it's figuring out what needs they're addressing and not focusing on like the topical sort of cosmetic trends of what made Dark Souls, but really digging into like the strategic nature of it. So the fast fall itself is, it's a investment strategy. Like there's less risk here, but there's also less upside because now you're competing on margin again. So you have to be aware of that when you're making these decisions. And one of the best lessons I learned in business school is that there's not really good or bad decisions usually. They're all trade-offs. And you got to figure out which trade-off is most suitable to you, most honors your core values, most honors your strategic goals. So there's a trade-off there between known and unknown, and compete on margin versus unique and valuable. And you got to decide what the right balance point is for you and what's right for your customer base and your game and your project and your finances. Does that better answer it?
Yes, thank you.
Cool, thank you. Please.
Hey, great talk, thanks.
Thank you.
How important do you think it is, or I guess I'd like to know your thoughts on changing these design principles from game to game versus companies that make their whole kind of image in, one style of game over and over? Yeah,
the trick again, it's another trade-off. If you keep making the same game like From Software, you can establish a lot of best practices, you accrue a lot of, intelligence about it, you accrue a lot of, what's the word I'm looking for? Core competency about what that thing is. The trick there, though, is, for instance, Destiny, Bungie. It's going to be hard, and it's going to take a long time before Destiny ever gets mentioned without Halo coming up. It's going to be very hard for, like, Shinji Mikami. He made The Evil Within, which is very similar to Resident Evil 4. He's going to have a hard time making any game like that without somebody bringing, this is the guy who made Resident Evil 4. So the more you stay within your comfort zone, the more you're going to live in your own shadow. And that's that's neither good nor bad, but that's a trade-off you got to consider. How much do you want to be beholden to your legacy versus how much do you want to stick within your core competency where you can maximize your efficiencies?
But like IKEA, we all know IKEA's principles, and they're not starting new businesses or new stores that have totally different principles. I'm wondering, do they really succeed because it's so consistent and we always know? Or can you make games that are, obviously you can make games that keep changing it up, but I just wonder how important it is to basically know your shtick and own it and put your stake in the ground so people stay away from your space.
The more formidable you are, the more of the expert you are, it's going to be hard to go head-to-head with Cliff Bleszinski on a third-person shooter kind of thing. So yeah, it does become easier to stake out your claim and make it known that I own this, and the more you show up here, the more you reinforce my position as the industry leader. The more when Resident Evil was at its heyday in the PlayStation era, the more games that showed up that were survival horror, the more they reinforced A, the name survival horror, and B, reinforced Resident Evil as the premier game in that genre. We own it, and we define these terms. And when that market started getting crowded, they reinvented it and redefined what survival horror is. But still, Dead Space comes out, Resident Evil 4 still comes up. Gears of War came out, Resident Evil 4 came up. So that's part of the trade-off. You secure that position, and everybody who shows up to your party reinforces that you're the head of the party, which is a good thing. But you also, if you want to go start a new party that's kind of on playing the same dance list or music list, you're also going to be in your own shadow. Does that answer your question?
Yep, thank you.
Hey, quick one. Can you think of any games that did appeal to everyone that said anybody with a screen in front of their face, whether whatever they're doing, they're gonna play this game and they're gonna enjoy
it? It definitely works. Rock Band, Wii Bowling, Super Mario Brothers. There are definitely examples. And again, trade-offs. You shouldn't not target a broad spectrum just because some dork at GDC said so. It's just be aware of the trade-off you're taking. That the more you make a game for everybody, the less you make a game for anybody. And there's a balance point of what your game design is, how broadly acceptable it is, how big that market is, the likeliness of that market to buy with a game being as not specific as it is. These are all numbers that need to factor in your calculus. So it can totally work. We've seen it work. So the goal is not to say you have to do this, but what I want to reinforce is that you should be intentional about these decisions and really think about the consequences of your trade-offs. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thanks.
Sure. All right, thank you very much, everybody. I really appreciate it.